Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is the second talk on the topic of refuge, taking refuge. In the first talk, I discussed a little bit the general idea of refuge, turning to something that is worthy of your trust in order that it supports you, protects you, inspires you, and guides you. Something that protects us mainly from ourselves. It's that confidence in the path, in the Buddha, in the goodness, and so on, that protects us from our weaker moments of anger and all the sort of nasty things that spoil our lives and other people's lives. But it also protects us in many other ways too. Today, I'd like us to consider the different ways of taking refuge according to the Hinayana and the Mahayana methods. There is also a Vajrayana way. When we understand a little more about Buddhism, and in particular this topic about the different types of Buddhists, so well explained by Atisha and Gampopa as the three types of precious human being, then we understand that Dharma is not the same for everyone because we are using it for a different goal. Of the three types, the first is using it to be a better human being, to get a better rebirth, to make the world a better place. But it's very much in the context of a continuing world and continuing on in the world. There's a second type who is mainly seeking total liberation of their own mind, to get out of suffering forever and to free their own mind through meditation and through renunciation. And then there's a third type, the Bodhisattva, who is from the outset dedicated to serving and helping everyone to achieve not just liberation from samsara, but all of the qualities of a fully enlightened being, a Buddha. So we call those three ways, all of them worthy and noble, the ways of the three types of precious human being. They all take refuge. But the first two types take the basic Buddhist refuge, let's call it basic refuge or Hinayana refuge, and the Bodhisattvas take the Mahayana refuge. What are the differences? There are three main ones. The motivation through which you take refuge is different. That's one. Secondly, the duration of the commitment you're taking is different. And thirdly, very interestingly, what you are taking refuge in is expressed differently. And that's what we'll consider just now. First, the motivation. Well, that will be the motivations I've just described of those, let's say, dedicated Buddhists who still are involved with existence, but who want to live in a very ethical, good way in this world to make good karma and to have good future rebirths, and so on. That's their motivation. And then those who are seeking individual liberation, their own liberation, total liberation of their minds, they have that as their motivation. Now those first two types, when they take refuge in Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, do so through their own motivations, which when we look at them are mainly to do with oneself. They are not selfish, that's too much to say, but they are to do with one's own life, one's own mind, one's own future rebirths, one's own liberation. So it's a motivation mainly focused on just one sentient being, which is the person who takes refuge. That's the first type of motivation. The second type of motivation, that of the bodhisattva, concerns hundreds, thousands, millions, endless sentient beings. From the very beginning, when they take refuge, they are taking refuge from their heartfelt loving care for everyone. That is the reason they're turning to the Buddha and to the Dharma teachings and to the Sangha. They want to make themselves a servant of the world. That's the first difference then. It's one of motivation. The second difference is one of duration. The first two types take their refuge vow, their refuge commitment, from the time of the ceremony, so we say from today until the moment I die. And the reasoning behind that is that, if we exclude sleep, of course, until we die, we are responsible for ourselves. We can make a promise and do our very best to keep it. But after death, we don't know how we're going to be reborn. There are the after-death experiences, and then we're a baby, and memory is pretty much wiped out. So it wouldn't make much sense in that way of thinking of making a promise that goes beyond death. We take the promise for as long as we know we can do our very best to keep it. So when we take refuge, which we do by repeating the vow 3 times after the teacher, then we say, from today until I die. The thinking of the bodhisattva is different. What one says is from now until enlightenment is reached. So one's taking the commitment of refuge from now until whenever it is, in whichever life in the future, one is enlightened. And although what I've just said applies, the bodhisattva cannot give a cast iron guarantee that in the next life they will remember their bodhisattva commitment. The idea is to set within one's consciousness a promise so deep that in the next life or in future life there's a very, very good chance of that waking up, as perhaps it has for you in this life. Something, someone, one day will just awaken that overwhelming love and care for others, something deep inside that feels like it's stirred from an age-old past. So the idea of the bodhisattva, not just with taking refuge, but again and again afterwards in their practice, is to sow powerful seeds within consciousness, seeds that are so powerful they'll even survive death and rebirth and growing up again in another place. And they will be there to help us in the future and bring us back as quickly as possible in future lives to the bodhisattva path. So that's the second difference. It's the duration of the promise. The third difference is in what one's taking refuge in. And here we have a much more detailed, complicated difference in a way. In the Hinayana refuge, the basic refuge, one is taking refuge in the Buddha as the teacher, in the Dharma as the teachings, and in the Sangha as the best community that preserve those teachings, as you may have heard if you've been looking at the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha series of talks. For the Buddha, they are mainly taking refuge in the historical Buddha as both the person who gave us the method and the teachings and the clear ideas, and also as the perfect example of somebody who put all of that to practice and who gained total liberation because of it. So the Buddha is the teacher, and the actual word in Tibetan for teacher also means the one who shows by example, shows us the way. And very often in that level of teachings, let's say the humanity of the Buddha is very much stressed, and the life of the Buddha, and so on. In the Mahayana, we take refuge in the Buddha as the three kayas, which is a topic I explained in the series on the Buddha. We're not so much looking at that particular person, Prince Gautama, Prince Siddhartha in history, who was Indian. It doesn't matter that he was Indian. He could have been Japanese, Chinese, French, Italian, African. It didn't matter that he was a prince. In that particular life it mattered, but in the stories of other Buddhas we see them in all sorts of social situations. All of that is secondary. What's really of interest is the fact that the Buddha achieved enlightenment. So what is enlightenment? What was it that his mind became? Nothing to do with his body, his caste, his life details, but his mind became those three kayas. His mind became enlightened. And when we describe enlightenment, we describe it through the three kayas. The three kayas is our way of describing the way that enlightenment is experienced by Buddhas, by liberated bodhisattvas, and by beings in the six realms. The same enlightenment, but how it's experienced by the person who is enlightened, the Buddha, how it's experienced by those very, very pure minds that are already free of samsara, the minds of the bodhisattvas, how they experience it, and then how the likes of us can experience it. As you'll know, this is a vast topic, but basically the Dhammakaya is the eternal, the timeless, void nature that is the ultimate truth of everything. The lucid clarity of voidness. And that lucid clarity of voidness, the Dhammakaya, is what the Buddha truly is, with all of its qualities of wisdom and compassion and power. It has no location, no shape, no color. That same enlightenment is experienced by great bodhisattvas through the interface of their senses. So they see Buddhas, they hear Buddhas teaching, they even smell the purity of the Buddha as wonderful fragrances. They experience the pure lands of the Buddhas, the mandalas of the Buddhas, from which they are continuously receiving the most amazing teachings in the way that's described in the Bodhisattva scriptures. So we call that the Sambhogakaya, their very perfect access, but through their senses, where they see and hear Buddhas. And then for beings who are in the six realms of samsara, when their karma is good, when the circumstances are right, they too can experience Buddhas as teachers or as people who help them. And in the famous words of Shantideva, he says, when I'm a Buddha, may I be a bed for the sick, a bridge for those who want to cross a river, a nurse, a doctor, and so on. There are many ways the Buddha can manifest in the worlds of sentient beings, and we call those Nirmanakaya. So when we take refuge in the Buddha, we are taking refuge in this much more cosmic and universal aspect, the real meaning of Buddha, which is what Prince Siddhartha became, that you and I will become, that all of the Buddhas become, the three kayas. There's a third way we take refuge in the Buddha, in the Mahayana, which is to realize that what Siddhartha achieved, what all of the Buddhas achieve when they become the three kayas, is no more and no less than the true nature of each and every one of us. So when we take refuge in the Buddha, we are also taking refuge in our own truest and deepest nature, not in somebody other, but in the real truth of ourselves. When one takes refuge in the Dharma in the general way, in the Hinayana way, then it is the teachings, it is the Tripitaka, the three collections of the Buddha's teachings in their 12 sections, so the Sutra, the Abhidharma, the Vinaya, and the various methods that are taught in them. In the Mahayana, we take refuge in that, but primarily, as we saw in our studies on the Dharma, we're taking refuge in what is known as the real Dharma, the Dharma of realization. And we know that all of those words and ideas and methods and techniques are there so that our mind awakens. It discovers firsthand the truth, and eventually it gets what's called authentic realization, when beyond all the words we don't need to believe a dogma, an idea. The truth is vividly there in one's own mind. Direct realization. That is the Dharma we are taking refuge in. That journey to direct realization, all of the steps of direct realization through the bodhisattva levels up to the total Dharma, the total realization of a Buddha. In the basic refuge, one takes refuge in the Sangha, which is the earthly community of the monks and the nuns. When enough of them, pure ones with their conduct, are gathered together, that makes the Sangha. In the Mahayana refuge, we are particularly interested in the realized Sangha, those bodhisattvas who have attained that authentic realization of Dhammakaya, of the void nature of mind. So what one takes refuge in is different in the Hinayana and the Mahayana refuges. How long one takes one's commitment of refuge, saying, I promise to maintain my refuge in those, varies from this life through to all the way until one is oneself enlightened. And then the motivation is different. It's either primarily for one's own well-being or liberation, or for the sake of all sentient beings. That's it for this short talk. It was about the differences between Mahayana and basic or Hinayana refuge. Of course, when we say Hinayana, which means the lesser yana, some people don't like that term, we are not talking about Buddhist schools. We're not talking about geography and history. We're talking about psychology. A type. It's called Hina, lesser, because it benefits one person, the person who's practicing. It's called Maha, greater, because it's there to bring benefit to huge numbers of beings. It's as simple as that. Hinayana, Mahayana. But if you don't like the word Hinayana, some people don't, we can say basic refuge and bodhisattva refuge. In the next talk, I say something about Vajrayana refuge, and in the one after that, about the actual refuge ceremony. Thank you so much for listening. Speak to you soon. Go well wherever you are.